What is differentiation? So this is a very, very technical, teachery term, and it's one that you might not see very often. To be honest, it's one that generally speaking I try to avoid using when I'm speaking to or writing for audiences that aren't teachers, basically. But that being said, it's a concept that really gets to the heart of what teaching is actually all about. And so I think actually there might be some value in trying to explain it in as clear a way as possible, because actually the more I think about it, the more I feel that maybe to understand education, you really need to understand differentiation. And it's also very striking that lots of, perhaps the most confident commentators and columnists and such who write about education maybe don't understand it as well as they should. So what is differentiation? Basically, it's about understanding the differences between pupils. But that's not to be confused with something like learning styles. This idea that there are visual learners and auditory learners and hands-on learners, and we should try and tailor our teaching towards that. That's nonsense and has been debunked a long time ago. But students do all have different individual starting points and capacities and interests. And as a teacher, a big part of the job is making sure that you are, so far as possible, taking that into account as part of your lessons, as part of your instruction, to try to make sure that every individual in the room can make the best possible progress. And there are lots of different ways in which this can be done, and I'm going to take you through a few of them just now. So the most obvious thing I think that a lot of people would think of would be something like differentiating work in terms of different groups. So we talk about sometimes the idea of ability grouping, which is complicated and a bit problematic, but in its most basic form, people maybe think of things like, their kid maybe at primary school is in a particular reading group or a particular numeracy group, maybe even in the kind of early stages of primary school. That sort of grouping by ability, or perceived ability at least, is about allowing teachers to tailor the material that students engage with. The idea then being that each of those individuals, if they're in the right groups, will make better progress than you would see if you just threw, the same reading book at all 30 kids in front of you. It's quite intuitive when you think about it like that. You can also differentiate by task. Now that can be done with ability groups, but it can be done without it as well. It just means giving different tasks to different students in the room. Again, not without its controversies, not without issues, when it becomes a bit problematic. But fundamentally, it's about providing different levels of challenge to different individuals. Sometimes you might do that, for example, by presenting an element of choice in terms of the tasks that young people might engage with. And that's actually allowing a skilled teacher to also differentiate between the students that need really stretched and the ones that need maybe kind of foundational support. Once again, it's all kind of dependent on a teacher's perception of student progress and the student's ability. And this is where, when we talk about the importance of ongoing assessment by teachers, this is where all that starts to become really important as well. You could differentiate by pace in your class. So you might expect some students to work faster than others, and that might be managed by maybe providing a lot of what you might call extension tasks that are there and available if some people finish, knowing fine well that a whole bunch of them are definitely going to finish early, and actually some of these extension tasks are actually things that you've designed for a particular group of students. They'll definitely get there, and others might get there as well, so it can perform that kind of stretch function for them. So that allows students to progress at something more like their own pace, which obviously is going to help them develop in a more sort of sustainable kind of way. There's another way of looking at all this though, which is you don't differentiate by input, which is what all those examples were, but where you differentiate by outcome. And that's where maybe you expect a different levels of work from different students in front of you. Maybe that means different length. Maybe some students will produce 200 or 300 words of writing, for example, and that'll be great for them. That for them is a really big achievement. But some other student can produce an awful lot more than that, and you expect them to do their best at all times as well. So they don't get away with just writing 300 words. They get pushed to do more. Maybe it's about quality. Maybe there are some students where what you're looking for them to do is just hit the basics of what you might call success criteria. And on the other hand, there might be students who are perfectly capable of hitting those basics and you want to see them go beyond that. Something you might see maybe in, like, if you ever see your kids' work getting sent home or something, is this thing called 2 stars and a wish. It's a feedback system that's used. That's a good way of doing this. Because what you write down there, the 2 stars and a wish, 2 stars being 2 things that are good and the 1 wish being the 1 thing to improve, they can be very different from student to student. And within your 2 stars and a wish, particularly the wish, you can use that to differentiate in terms of what you expect of these 2 different students. You can also do it even by like accepting a range of different kinds of work. I used to quite like doing this when I was in teaching, where the options there where you can say to students, listen, I don't mind what format you give me these answers, this project, whatever that happens to be, and allowing that element of choice in terms of what they are producing at the end can also be a good way to allow students to maybe present their work to a teacher using the methods that is going to best represent their abilities. And that is something that, you know, we count as part of the differentiation process. And this is just a small snapshot. There are lots and lots of very complicated discussions you can have about the mechanisms by which we do differentiation and what the most useful ones are and what some of the drawbacks are, etc, etc. But we're not going to go into all of that because we'll be here all day, but I will quickly touch on why all of this matters. And the reason that I kind of got at earlier on is that actually differentiation is education, or at least it is the kind of education that we want to see in schools. Differentiation is the difference between lessons and lectures. That's it. And we don't want kids in schools being lectured. We want them to have lessons, which means we need differentiation. Successful schooling for pupils depends on successful differentiation by teachers. But as soon as you get to that point, it's not difficult to see why all this depends on resources. So the bigger the class, the harder the task. The more students in front of you, the harder it is to individualise for each of them. The more it becomes about, you know, grouping a few together here or there, the less accurate the whole process becomes, the less individual the whole process becomes. And the other thing is that all of this demands significant amounts of non-contact time, because if you want teachers to sit and work all this stuff out and prepare and plan all this kind of thing, give all this individualised feedback, well, I presume we're okay with giving them some time and space to actually do that job, because otherwise what we're asking for is simply impossible. There's this phrase in education, and it's teachers' working conditions or students' learning conditions. The thing about differentiation, proper differentiation, you know, individualised, responsive teaching tailored for the needs of the young people in the room, is that it's maybe the clearest example that you could find of this, you know, working conditions and learning conditions connection. And if we want our young people to have these great individualised lessons as opposed to these generic lectures that are just for the same for everyone in the room, then again we're going to have to confront the fact that teachers need the time and the space and the resources to make that kind of learning, the learning we want to see, to make that happen in schools.